Shalom, brethren. This video that I'm doing is going to be specifically targeting the people that call themselves Barbadians or Bajans on the island of Barbados. However, it includes many of the other Caribbean islands such as Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Vincent, Grenada, Antigua, the Bahamas, and many of the other Caribbean islands, which are populated by the so-called descendants of the so-called African slaves that were brought into the Caribbean islands by the Europeans. There's a phenomena that has been taking place for over 30 to 40 years now. However, this phenomena has gained more and more traction as more and more exposure of the phenomena has been increasing. This phenomena is called the awakening of the Hebrew Israelites. Now, the word Hebrew is just an English rendering of the original word, which is Eve. I will go into detailed study on this word Hebrew and Eve at a later junction in this video. There are a great number of highly educated professors in Barbados and also in the other Caribbean islands that are of African descent. These professors have been negligent in teaching some valid truths that need to be taught, that need to be exposed, and that needs light to be shed on them. So my endeavor as a Barbadian, so-called Barbadian or Bajan, is to shed light on some of the events that occurred in history pertaining to our forefathers that were forcibly brought to this island as slaves. Who are we? Who are we? Are we Bajans? Are we Christians? Are we pagans? Or are we the children of the prophets, the Israelites? Who are we? Let's examine this based on the Bible, based on history, based on some science, and in some cases empirical evidences. I will endeavor to do my very best to bring forth the history from the secular accounts and the biblical history from God's word pertaining to this topic, this subject. The book of Romans 15:4, it reads, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope." So here Paul is saying that everything that was written in the scriptures in the past, the Old Testament, the laws, the statutes, the judgments, and the commandments, the prophecies, which are the testimonies, these things were written for us to learn from and to understand. We may understand where we were and where we are going. Hear this word that Christ spoke to his apostles over 1800 years ago, perhaps even more. This is John 6:63. He said, "The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life." So we know that life literally comes from the one we call Jesus Christ, whose name is correctly spoken Yahuwah HaMashiach. Now, he also said to his apostles in John chapter 14, verses 16 to 17, "And I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter, that he may abide with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it seeth him not, neither knoweth him, but ye know him, for he dwell with you and shall be within you." Verses 26 to 27 reads, "But the Comforter, which is the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things, and bring all things to your remembrance, whatsoever I have said unto you." So we know that the Comforter who comes in the name of Yahushua, this Comforter is going to teach us all things, and will bring all things to our remembrance. Brothers and sisters, a lot of us has been educated according to the world's system. The world, as the scripture says, does not know God. And if the world does not know God, that education that we would have gotten from the world is not going to point us back to God. This is why God has sent his Spirit, so that the Spirit will guide us into all truth. We don't need the world's educational systems to lead us into the truth of God, when God's Spirit has been poured out upon his people to lead them into truth, to lead them back to him. So now, as I endeavor to address the issue of truth, the truth about who the so-called Bajans are, and many of the other peoples that dwell on the Caribbean islands that are descendants of the so-called African slaves, I will let the truth speak, and you discern. You decide who you are according to the truth. The west coast of Africa was known also as the Slave Coast, and in some cases the Gold Coast. This very fact is why we can understand that the so-called blacks in Barbados that are of so-called African slave descent, this very fact will let us know who these people truly are. The truths that are bared out in what I'm going to read to you will help you to identify and understand who these people are. Brothers and sisters, bear in mind that Barbados was generally the first port of call in the triangular trade because it is the most easterly island in the Caribbean, making it closer to West Africa than the other islands. So as I address Barbados, I want to expound a little on the word Barbados. The word Barbados was derived from the Portuguese explorer Pedro Campos, who in 1536 stopped over on the island presently called Barbados while en route to Brazil, and thus named the island Los Barbados, the bearded ones, presumably after the island's fig trees with long hanging aerial roots, a beard-like resemblance. The history of slavery in Barbados. Between 300 AD and 1200 AD, Barbados was inhabited by the Arawak Indians. They were driven off the island by invading Carib Indians from Venezuela, who then left Barbados around the time of the first Europeans that sailed into the region. By the early 1500s, all signs of Amerindian life had vanished. In 1536, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Campos stopped over in Barbados en route to Brazil and named the island Los Barbados, the bearded ones, presumably after the island's fig trees with their long hanging aerial roots, a beard-like resemblance. Although known to the Portuguese and Spanish, the British were the first settlers in 1625. Captain John Powell landed on Barbados with his crew and claimed the uninhabited island for England. 2 years later, his brother Henry Powell landed with a party of 80 settlers and 10 African slaves. So we can automatically see here where the name Powell in Barbados and most other Caribbean islands would have started from. It goes on also to say, the group established the island's first European settlement, Jamestown, on the western coast at what is now called Whole Town here in Barbados. They were welcomed only by a herd of Portuguese hogs thought to be left there by Campos, whose intention was to use them as food on return voyages. The slave history of Barbados started after Captain Powell bought 10 slaves in 1627. The slave population in 1629 was still diminutive, with not more than 50 Amerindians and African slaves working the land, in construction, and in the homes. This low slave population was due to few persons being able to buy slaves at that time. Slaves brought into Barbados came from various tribes out of the forest region of West Africa, during village raids. Some of the African tribes were Ibos, that's E-B-O-E-S, Papas, that's P-A-W/P-A-W-S, and Igbo, that's I-G-B-O. They came via slave trade forts on the African west coast set up by Europeans. Such forts were the Axim, that's A-X-I-M, and Elmina, that's Elmina. After being traded for trinkets, the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and sold to plantation owners. In 1636, officials passed a law declaring all slaves brought into Barbados, whether African or Amerindian, were to be enslaved for life. It was later extended to their offsprings. At this time, there were only 22 free colored persons on the island. During the 1700s, the main source of labor for cotton and tobacco was indentured servants from Europe, while Amerindians from the Guyanas were imported to teach agriculture. As the cotton and tobacco industry started to fail because of the lack of labor due to terrible conditions for indentured servants, the sugar industry emerged. Sugar in Barbados at that time was used only for feedstock, as fuel, and in the production of rum. Due to the demand for a strong labor force after the sugar revolution took place, Africa became the obvious choice for slaves because they were strong and Africa was closer than Europe to the Caribbean. Slave ships also traveled faster because they were assisted by the trade winds blowing towards the west, the triangular trade. The triangular trade included the slave trade and was the link between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. The ships left Western Europe filled with guns and manufactured goods towards West Africa to be exchanged for slaves, who were taken to Barbados and the other Caribbean islands to be sold for sugar, called the Middle Passage, which was shipped to Europe. Now this that I'm going to read to you is the plantocracy of Barbados. In 1642, Barbados planters found a new source of revenue when the Dutch introduced them to sugarcane farming. By the mid-1600s, sugarcane plantations were producing and exporting sugar, attracting wealthy landowners with political affiliations, enhancing the island's plantocracy. This new emergence of elite planters excluded poor whites and non-whites from Barbados's political infrastructure. The island soon gained the largest white population of any of the English colonies in the Americas, becoming the springboard for the English colonization in the Americas. As the cost of white labor rose in England, more slaves were imported from West Africa, especially the Gold Coast, and by extension, more black slaves were brought to Barbados. The main group of slaves imported were Ibibios, Yorubas, Eljibo, the Ifk, as well as Ashanti, Fanti, Ga, and Fam. By the mid-1600s, there was over 5,600 black African slaves in Barbados, and by the early 1800s, there were over 385,000. This is even more than the present population of Barbados in 2019. The constant importation of slaves was caused by the high mortality rate due to the bad conditions and overwork. By the 1700s, Barbados was one of the leaders in the slave trade from the European colonies. So this would tell us that most of the slaves that came out of Africa out of West Africa. Most of the tribes that came out of West Africa were first landed in Barbados. That is why today you would see there are so much different variations in terms of the skin tones of the peoples that live in Barbados, because they would have all came from the west coast of Africa from different tribes of those peoples that came into Barbados. During the 1800s, the elite were building elaborate estates like Yahsarahahl and St. Nicholas Abbey, which still exists here in Barbados, while controlling the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council. They encouraged slave reproduction to avoid more importation of slaves. So what they were doing, they were having the male slaves breed multiple women so that the plantation owners, the slave owners, would not have to import more slaves from Africa. So today you see in Barbados that there's a trend of men having more than one woman, multiple women, and an abundance of children. This is something that has been inbred in us as a result of slavery. These are things that we need to recognize and understand so that we can understand what really happened to us and why we are doing some of the things that we're still doing. It goes on to say, Barbados became the only island in the British Caribbean which no longer depended or was dependent on slave imports. So you see, we were bred as animals. We were reproduced as animals for the sole purpose of labor. And today in Barbados, unfortunately, we have a lot of men that are breeding women, more than one woman, and bringing forth an abundance of children. And this, again, I reiterate that this is something that was inbred in us as a result of how we were treated as livestock by the slave owners. I know that what I've just read from history is a lot to digest, but you have technology in your hands. You can pause, you can rewind, you can skip forward, and you can do the research on your own. Most of this information would have come from the website Fun Barbados, and I'm sure that it correlates with many other historical evidences that are in the West Indies, the University of the West Indies, and many other higher learning institutions in the Caribbean islands, whether it's in Jamaica, at Mona, in Trinidad, whether it's in St. Vincent, in Barbados, in Grenada, wherever, but the information is there. This is information that needs to be exposed. This is information that needs to be disseminated so that the people can truly know who they are in these times that we're living in. It is imperative that we as a people know who we are, know where we came from, and know our stature, know our place in this world. Another point of interest that most of us need to recognize is that the first slave ship that came over to the Caribbean islands in the 1500s was called the good ship Jesus. It was owned by Germans who were supposedly Christians. Many of the other ships that came over with slaves, such as the Santa Maria, the Nina, the Pinto, Hope, and many others carried Christian names, and they were owned by Christians. This should make one think, well, if that's the case, what about the actual Christian religions of Methodist, Anglican, Wesleyan, Roman Catholic, and many others that are so established, firmly established in Barbados for over 100 years, and in some cases more than 200 years? It should not then surprise you or shock you that most, if not all, of these churches, these religions, were owned by the plantation owners, who would have been so-called Christians. I use the word so-called because I want you all to draw your attention to the truths that are being highlighted in what is being revealed. Now, that was the history, some of the true history that occurred as a result of slavery on who are the descendants of the so-called African slaves that were brought to Barbados. Now let us go to a second source, to the second source. Let's go to the Bible. Let us see if the Bible confirms or exposes any of what has occurred in history, and let's see if any of the people that's in Barbados can be identified with anything of the ancient peoples who were called Ivri, who we know today as Hebrews. This is Deuteronomy chapter 28. When we read Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 1 to verse 14, these are the blessings that would have occurred and that would have followed Israel if they kept the commandments, laws, statutes, and judgments of Yahuwah. They would follow them. The blessings would follow Israel wherever they go. Remember that Israel is the nation of people that descended from Abraham. Remember that in Genesis 14 and 13, Abraham and his seed would bring forth justice and judgment on the earth to distribute the wealth of the earth with equity. So now let's see if these people in Barbados, along with many other peoples that are in the Caribbean islands that are of so-called African descent, let's see if they have any relationship to what is being said thousands of years ago to Moses by God in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. We will read from verse 15. It says, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord, Yahuwah thy Elohim, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." So something would happen to them, something negative, something bad would happen to them. It would overtake them if they did not listen to the commandments. As we skip down to verse 28, it says, "Yahuwah shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart, and thou shalt group at noonday as the blind groupeth in darkness, and thou shalt not prosper in thy ways, and thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and thou shalt not gather the grapes thereof." So this is what occurred to us as a people when we were in the land of Canaan, which is known as Israel, as a result of us disobeying God. But now when we go down to Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we read from verse 46, it says, "And they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. This day that should be upon them, upon us." This day is making reference to the curses that will be upon us. When we read, I'm just skipping because Deuteronomy chapter 28 is pretty long. So I'm just skipping through the verses, but you can definitely read through for yourself. Verse 48, it says, Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee. Well, who did our foreparents have to go to when they wanted anything? Whether it was food, water, clothing, whatever. They had to go to their masters, the slave masters. And of course, that iron, that shackles that was on our neck and on our hands and our feet, when we came off the slave ships, that stayed on us till it destroyed us physically and mentally. This is why we need to know who we are, so that we can rise up to be the righteous nation that we were selected to be, a kingdom of priests unto Yahuwah, to teach the world righteousness, justice, and judgment according to Yahuwah's ways. Brothers and sisters, yes, we were born on this island called Barbados, but are we truly Barbadians? Let's get into the crux of the matter before us. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68. It says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships." We know that Egypt is synonymous with bondage. That's where our foreparents were in bondage. The correct word here should be Mitzrayim. This word Egypt is just a Greek rendering of the word Mitzrayim. Verse 68 says, "And Yahuwah shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more." Moses was telling us this, our forefathers this, in the wilderness. He says, "And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies." When we went back into Egypt, back into bondage, we will be sold unto our enemies, for bondmen and for bondwomen. Now, brothers and sisters, a bondman and a bondwoman is simply a slave. That's what it is. In Bajan terminology, when I want to know what it's talking about, there's a slave, here's a slave. A bondman and a bondwoman, here is a slave. Now, we need to be mindful that when our foreparents, the Israelites, went down into Egypt the first time, they went down after Joseph sent to bring his father and his brethren and their families down into Egypt. They would have walked down on feet, on donkeys, and on camels. That was the first time they went into Egypt. The second time that they went into Egypt as a nation, went into bondage as a nation, is when we would have been sold as far back as the 700s by the Arabs in what is known as the Arabian slave trade or the Arabic slave trade, and later on in the late 1400s going into the 1500s in the European slave trade, what is better known as the transatlantic slave trade. So now, brothers and sisters, the only nation of people that can identify with what's written here in Deuteronomy chapter 28, the only nation of people that can identify with all of these curses, specifically all of these curses, is one nation. That nation is the nation of Israel. The specifics of being bondmen, the specifics of being brought into Egypt, into slavery by way of ships, the specifics of a nation who we do not know, whose tongue we do not understand, will come upon us and overtake us. These specifics only pinpoint one nation of people. It is so pinpointed to the point where it says you will be called a proverb, a byword, nigger, black American, coon, coconut, etc. This is scripture. So now my question to those of us that are of African, so-called African descent, that live on this island Barbados, my question to you is, who or what are you? Are you a Bajan? Are you a Christian? Are you a pagan? Or are you an Israelite? Ivrit, Yahsarahahl, a Hebrew Israelite. I'm not talking about those brothers that you see on the street corners who are demeaning our people and not preaching the gospel in love and in truth. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about who are you truly. Now, if you say that you're a Christian, we know that Christianity was paganized, was merged, was synchronized with paganism as a result of what Constantine did in about 272 AD. Brothers and sisters, it begs you to think, it begs you to research, to see whether what is being presented is true or false. If it can be denied, if it can be proven. The technology is there, the information is there for the research to be accessed. No one can deny it. So now, I have presented true secular history regarding the so-called African slaves that came over from the west coast of Africa to Barbados and to many of the other Caribbean islands, and of their descendants. Who are they? We know for sure that they're not Africans, because the Hamites, who are the true Africans, who are the children of Phut, Cush, Canaan, and the Egyptians, and the Nubians, we know that they're not Negroes. So who then are the Negroes? The Negroes are the Shemites. The Shemites, the descendants of the Shemites, from the lineage of Abraham, to the 12 tribes of Israel, who are scattered into all corners of the earth, whether it be the USA, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in the Caribbean, whether it be South America, whether it be in the furthest parts of the earth. This is who we are. The true Christians were followers of Christ. Simply put, this is what this word Christian means. They had continued to follow Christ's examples that he set forth while he was alive. They continued to follow his examples after he died. They kept the commandments, they kept the laws, the statutes, the judgments. This is what the true Christians did. But Constantine, a Roman emperor, when he came on the scene, he decided that he wanted to rule the world. And in order for him to rule the world, simply put, he had to find a way of ruling the known world then. What did he do? Simply merged Christianity with paganism. And today, in 2019, we have the modern Christians thinking that they're truly serving the Eloah, the Elohim of the Bible, Yahuwah. When they celebrate Christmas, they celebrate Easter, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Lent, and many other such so-called holidays. When in truth and in fact, they're just following paganism, which was upheld also throughout the years by the Roman popes, the Roman Jesuit popes, who call themselves God on earth, who say that they can change the laws in the Bible. That's what the Pope says. The Methodists, the Anglican, the Baptists, the Wesleyans, all of these so-called Protestant churches, they are whores of the mother whore, which is the Roman Catholic Church. You look at it, you examine it. These so-called Christians that came over as the slave owners of slave ships and slaves were the ones who owned the religions. Methodists, Baptists, Wesleyans, Calvinists, etc. So now, if you are a Christian based on traditional methods of the slave master, then you're definitely not a Christian. My last topic in this lesson study will be to address this word, Hebrew. The word Hebrew, Hebrew, is an English rendering of the Latin Hebraicus, Hebracus. However, if you read from the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would not see the word Hebrew, Hebrew, but rather the word Ehrverh, and it is pronounced Ewe. In English, it is written as EWE. The first time this name is used in the Torah is in Genesis chapter 14 verse 13. The word rendered as Hebrew here is in the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, listed under H5677. In the original Ewe or Hebrew language, it is spelled Yud, Resh, Bet, Ayin. In English, you would spell out these words as IVRI, and it is pronounced Ewe. The meaning of the word Ewe, it is to cross over, to pass over, to traverse. So the word Ewe, which is translated into English as Hebrew, is also rendered Ibri, I-B-R-I. Now, in Aramaic, it is rendered Ibray, I-B-R-A-Y, and in the Latin and Greek, it is rendered Hebreos, H-E-B-R-A-I-O-S. In the Old French, it is rendered Hebrew, E-B-R-E-U. Hence, we have the English word Hebrew, H-E-B-R-E-W. We can find the word crossover being explained and expressed in Judges chapter 24 verse 3. This is the river that Abraham would have crossed over. Hence, you would have read in Genesis chapter 14 verse 13, and Abraham the Hebrew, the one that crossed over the river. Now, brothers and sisters, I am no professor. I am no scholar. All I have is basic tools that I've used to bring forth this exposition on who we are in Barbados, the descendants of the so-called Africans. Who are we? That said, brethren, if there are any inconsistencies and any corrections, please do send it to the comment section or my email or my WhatsApp. Now, to address two other issues with regards to this topic. The first one is scientific evidence. The scientific evidence that is provided is DNA evidence. The DNA evidence is unrefuted that those so-called Africans that would have came across on slave ships to the island of Barbados and many other Caribbean islands, their DNA points them back to what is known as Israel or the Middle East to be the true Hebrew peoples. If one can afford a DNA test, you would simply be shocked and surprised to see who you are. The other evidence that is available is empirical evidence. For instance, we know that our foreparents, when they came across on the slave ships, they never scratched and scrawled their faces with the marks like the other so-called peoples of Africa. Matter of fact, that being one evidence, we also know that our foreparents would have circumcised on the 8th day. We also know that the slaves would have kept themselves, the males would have kept themselves away from women when the women were on the menstruals. This is only practiced amongst the Ewe, amongst the Hebrew Israelites. Whereas the other peoples, the Hamites, they never practiced this. We were well clothed. When you looked at our names of our people, the men carried names like Yahu, Yashar, Yah this and Yah that. Why? Because we were named after our tribes. Like Judah, we were named after our creator, Yahuwah. That is why most of our names would have been Yah this or Yah that. Brothers and sisters, I've tried to present this lesson in a format that is in the Bajan tongue, so to speak, that you can quickly understand what I'm saying and quickly go and do the research. Now, forgive me for using dialect where it is heard. It is intentional not to distract, but to attract and to draw your attention to what is being taught. This video has been presented to my fellow Barbadians and my fellow Caribbean people who can claim so-called African descendancy from those Africans that would have been brutally enslaved and brought over to the Caribbean islands as slaves. We are the descendants of those people. We are the true Hebrew Israelites, or in the mother language, the true Ivrit Yahsarahahl. Wake up, brothers. This journey has much more to be fulfilled, and it is dependent upon us. Shalom.